We shall now move to item 4. The Council will consider draft proposal L5 entitled The Human Rights Situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. I give the floor to the distinguished representatives of the United Kingdom to introduce the draft proposal.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UK presents this resolution on the human rights situation in Syria on behalf of a group of main sponsors: France, Germany, Italy, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UK and the US. It is with deep sadness that we present yet another resolution on Syria. The crisis in Syria continues to have a devastating impact on civilians. Men, women and children are denied their human rights day after day. This Council cannot remain silent. We are gravely concerned about indiscriminate attacks and the deliberate targeting of protected civilians which contravenes international law. The Assad government, Daesh and foreign fighters must stop the bloodshed. The UK fully supports the work of the UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura in trying to seek a political settlement. The recent cessation of hostilities agreement is a positive step forward. However, it is essential that the Commission of Inquiry continues its work to document violations and abuses of human rights committed by all parties. This resolution extends the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry for a further 12 months, and we call on the Syrian authorities to allow full access to the Commission. Mr. President, we have consulted colleagues exclusively on this text, extensively on this text. We held an open informal with all states and have sought to reflect their views. The resolution we present today is a balanced text. It calls on all parties to end the violence, respect human rights and comply with international law. We also recognise the tremendous efforts made by neighbouring countries to host millions of Syrian refugees. The humanitarian challenge remains enormous, which is why this resolution calls for the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to all those in need. Mr. President, this resolution deserves the broadest support within the Council, and we hope it can be adopted by consensus. Otherwise, we are letting down the very people that this Council is duty-bound to protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have been informed by the Secretariat that there are 9 additional co-sponsors. I now open the floor for members of the Council to make general comments. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Recently, the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic has changed radically. There's been agreement on a ceasefire, and the political process has begun. Currently in Geneva, there are talks underway between the delegation of the Syrian government and various opposition groups, with the mediation by the special envoy of the Secretary General, Staffan de Mistura. There's a real chance of stopping the bloodshed and returning this country from chaos towards a normal, peaceful settlement. Unfortunately, we have the impression that the sponsors of L5 have not noticed this or are deliberately ignoring it. And we cannot agree with the presentation by the authors of a text, like in other years, with bare accusals and politicized criticisms. It is noteworthy that the information from the recent report of the independent commission, whose mandate is being proposed for extension, is not adequately reflected in the proposal. The authors have not noticed the Commission's connection drawn between the opposition groups and the terrorist groupings. almost completely ignoring the illegal criminal groups and activities to destroy human rights, despite the fact that the Inquiry Commission has once more decisively called to stop the one-sided economic sanctions against Syria, which are the source of destruction of the entire Syrian people. The draft resolution says nothing about this. Instead, the authors seeking here continue to refer to biased and unreliable sources, including the Scissors report. Mr. President, we cannot deny that the human rights violations in Syria are being carried out, and the responsibility is carried by all parties to the conflict. But we must bear in mind that upholding human rights and sustainable development is not possible in principle. There is a strange paradoxical situation. Once again, we see a one-sided politicized resolution before the Council, which is calling for human rights to be upheld in words, but in the facts is undermining a fragile peace process which deserves to be supported by all sources. Mr. President, we would particularly like to note that this time the authors of the draft have not simply used standard accusations against Damascus, but have at the intergovernmental level decided to put their own historical interpretation on this, on the beginning of the Syrian conflict. There is a question here: why, in the text of the resolution, there is not a single word about support of terrorists from outside and the protests being stirred up in the northern provinces of Syria, the provision of munitions to unlawful armed groups? Why are we ignoring the intervention in Syrian affairs by foreign governments and ignoring the sanctions of the Security Council? Mr. President, the delegation of Russia is categorically against the adoption by the Council of the draft resolution L5 and calls for a vote on this. We hope that the states which are prepared, not in words but in deeds, to support the peaceful settlement in Syria will vote against this confrontational, politicized text. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. This time again, I will speak on behalf of the European Union. As the conflict in Syria enters its 6th year, it is civilians who continue to suffer on a daily basis. The situation remains seriously alarming, and systematic and widespread violation and abuses of human rights law and violation of international humanitarian law continue to be committed unabated. We remain gravely concerned that the action by the Syrian government forces and terrorist groups such as Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We condemn in the strongest terms the continued, gross and systematic and widespread human rights abuses carried out by Daesh in Syria. We reiterate that the Syrian authorities bear the responsibility to protect the civilian population and deplore their continued failure to do so. We note that the Syrian regime remains also responsible for large-scale and systematic violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We call up all parties to implement the terms of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 and release any arbitrarily detained person, particularly women and children. We recall that there cannot be no impunity for any of such violations and abuses and call the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. The resolution before us renews the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, whose work is instrumental in preparation for future accountability efforts, calls for an end to impunity, emphasizes the urgent need for accountability, and demands that the Syrian authorities cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry. The resolution also demands that the regime grant immediate, full and unfettered access throughout the Syrian Arab Republic, whereas millions of Syrians need humanitarian aid, some of whom living in besieged areas. Mr. President, The EU stands ready to provide support towards the achievement of a sustainable political solution, particularly to the work of the UN Special Envoy de Mistura to achieve a transition based on the Geneva Communiqué and Resolution 2254, and to continue working with partners and international actors in order to preserve Syria's territorial integrity and its multi-ethnic and multi-religious character. The European Union invites all members of the Human Rights Council to join consensus around this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Switzerland is very concerned by human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law committed by all parties in Syria. Switzerland fully supports the extension of the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry and thanks it for its essential work in the past 5 years. As regards Resolution L5, Switzerland was able to co-sponsor it. However, it regrets the designation of specific actors in OP6, which weakens the broader applicability of the resolution, while the reports of the Inquiry Commission emphasize that human rights violations and abuses and systematic repeated violations of international humanitarian law are committed by all parties to the conflict. Switzerland also recalls once more that the term foreign terrorist fighters used in the same paragraph in no way prejudices the status of these persons in international law, particularly in international humanitarian law. Switzerland also regrets the tendency to politicization in this text. Given the appalling violence in the Syrian conflict, it is the Council's responsibility to devote itself actively to contributing to improving respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Thank you. President, Ecuador, consistent with its ongoing policy and unbridled respect for human rights and peace, has invariably condemned human rights violations in any part of the world, regardless of the circumstances and the authors of such violations. In the specific case of the Syrian Arab Republic, Ecuador wishes to express its deep concern over the serious human rights situation in that country, over which the past 6 years serious human rights violations have been committed, as well as violations of international humanitarian law, with indiscriminate violations of the civilian population, extrajudicial killings, torture, and this all seriously affects women, children, persons with disabilities, civilian infrastructure, world heritage, and other infrastructure, creating a wave of IDPs and refugees without precedent. We condemn these events, and we wish to express our solidarity with all of the victims. We insist on the need to avoid impunity of all of the actors in this conflict that have a direct or indirect responsibility over any of these actions, including those that provide weapons and munitions to the different stakeholders or actors in the conflict. Unfortunately, despite the constructive participation of my country with an eye on ensuring comprehensive treatment of this crisis, the text of the draft resolution L5 maintains an exclusively unilateral security-based focus that goes against international standards, which do not guarantee or promote joint action with the people of Syria, nor comprehensive peace with respect for independence and sovereignty of Syria and the human rights of their people. For this reason, Ecuador will abstain from voting on this draft resolution. I call upon the Secretariat, President, to put this explanation in the record. Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China's position on country-specific human rights issues is clear. We always believe that constructive dialogue and cooperation must be used to handle differences in the field of human rights. We are opposed to any exerting pressure in the public in the field of human rights, nor are we in favor of imposing any external mechanism of inquiry. On the question of Syria, China does not have any self-interests. We believe that in discussing the human rights situation in Syria, the Council must uphold objectivity, and must work in favor of maintaining ceasefire momentum in the country, in favor of common fight against terrorism by all parties, and in favor of a political settlement of the Syrian question. It is regrettable, however, that L5 exerts lopsidedly pressure on one party and one party only. Its content is seriously out of balance. It does not contribute to the political settlement of the Syrian question, nor does it help to safeguard regional stability. Therefore, China will vote against that draft resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.